Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take, the most complex ideas, the densest research, and we really try to extract the precise nuggets of knowledge you need to be truly well informed. And today, we are tackling, well, probably the most foundational, the most inescapable fact of the human condition: death.
It really is the ultimate boundary condition for life.
Yeah.
The source material we're looking at today takes this really interesting two-pronged approach. We're going to move from ancient philosophy and the cold, hard logic of metaphysics, just trying to define what death even is, and then go straight into modern cognitive psychology.
And that's where we explore how our brains, our societies, our very identities are constructed almost entirely as this elaborate defense system against the awareness of our own ending. It's a massive topic, a daunting one for sure, but we have to face it. The philosopher and psychologist William James, he had this great observation that the knowledge of our own mortality is the worm at the core of human existence.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's the fundamental primal anxiety that's just silently fueling so much of what we do, our ambition, our creation, even our conflicts.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to give you a kind of architectural plan of how we confront this certainty. First, we're going to do a really precise philosophical reconstruction of the arguments around the badness of death.
So showing why our fear of it is actually rational.
Exactly. And then second, we'll dissect the psychological defense systems.
Yeah.
Specifically, something called terror management theory that we all use, from creating art to, fierce nationalism, just to manage that terror.
That sounds like a journey we are definitely going to need a map for. So let's unpack this. And I guess to even begin to understand death, we have to start with the most basic, but, a frustratingly difficult question. What is life in the most rigorous sense?
That's exactly it. If we don't have a precise, defensible definition of life, then we can't rigorously define what death is the end of. And philosophers, biologists, they've struggled with this for centuries, mostly because the simple definitions, they just always run into these devastating counterexamples.
Okay, so where do we start? I'm guessing not with some sweeping, poetic definition.
No, not at all. We start with Peter van Inwagen, who gives one of the most rigorous but also one of the most narrow modern views. He argues that a life is a purely biological event.
It's a biological event.
And crucially, he says this event takes place entirely inside the organism's skin.
Okay, I find that restriction really fascinating, but I have to challenge it right away. Doesn't focusing just on the biological event miss the most important part? The conscious biographical experience that we actually value.
And that is precisely the challenge his view invites, but it's intentional. Van Inwagen wants to strip away all the external effects and just focus on the physical process. He uses the example of the philosopher Bertrand Russell. In this narrow view, Russell's life included things like cellular respiration, the oxygenation of his hemoglobin molecules,
Yep.
The internal biological stuff. But the publication of his philosophical works,
It doesn't count.
no, those are external results. They're not
Yeah.
part of the biological event of his life itself.
So the organism is just a self-sustaining process.
That's it. He uses this helpful analogy. He says, the organism is like a parade. A parade is an event that's made up solely of the marching activities of the people in it. It's a defined process, a dynamic flow.
I see.
So similarly, the organism is just defined by the self-organizing, integrated activities of all its constituent molecules.
But trying to pin down that necessary self-organizing process, that seems impossible using just common sense criteria. This is where the simple definitions just fall apart, right?
They fail immediately. For centuries, definitions have leaned on this idea of life functionalism, which comes from Aristotle. It's just a list of necessary functions: nutrition, growth, reproduction, autonomous motion.
But modern science, even just common objects, they just smash this.
Completely. Give us the counterexamples.
Well, let's start with movement. A Roomba, a cleaning robot, it moves autonomously, it navigates its environment. That's a listed function, but it's obviously not alive.
Right.
But then you have the other side. What about organisms that are demonstrably alive, but they lack functions that are supposed to be essential?
Like a mule.
A mule, exactly. It's perfectly alive, but it's sterile, it can't reproduce. Or what about the adult silk moth? It's already done all its eating. It doesn't even have a digestive system. It just subsists on stored energy.
So it can't perform nutrition, but it's alive.
The functions model just collapses.
And even the most common modern attempt to define life,
Mhm.
relying on genetics, on the presence of DNA, that's also totally inadequate.
How so?
Well, it's completely inadequate. They sometimes call this the Jonah problem, after the prophet who was swallowed by the whale.
Hmm.
If simply having DNA defined life, then a corpse, which is just brimming with DNA, would have to be considered alive.
Right. And what about those really technical definitions, like the one from NASA?
The one that says life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. That one runs into another conceptual brick wall, but this time it's about the individual.
Explain that.
Darwinian evolution, by its very definition, is a process that applies to a species, a collection of organisms over many generations. It doesn't apply to an individual organism like your specific dog.
My dog can't evolve.
That single dog cannot undergo Darwinian evolution, yet that dog is most certainly alive. So the definition of life has to apply to the individual right here, right now.
Okay, so we need a definition that's rigorous, it applies to the individual, and it captures the essence of that individual maintaining itself, regardless of whether it can reproduce or is currently moving around. So if all those other definitions failed, what do philosophers propose?
This is where we get to what's called the compositional account of life. This account tries to integrate the idea of function without being reliant on any specific function being active at any given time. It says that an object is alive if its composition is under the control of its own parts, and those parts engage in vital activities that are integrated based on information they carry.
So the key mechanism here isn't moving or eating, but this internal information-carrying control like DNA and RNA that determines the organism's structure and all its ongoing processes.
Precisely. And this account successfully deals with those counterexamples. Mules are sterile, sure, but their biological parts are still actively controlling the composition of their body according to the genetic blueprint they carry.
And the silk moth?
The silk moth is living on stored energy, but its parts are still integrating all these activities according to its internal information to keep that structure going. The Roomba, for all its movement, has no parts, whose main function is to control its own composition.
This clarity on what life is lets us move to a really crucial distinction, one that's vital for understanding death, especially when we start talking about things like cryonics or suspended animation.
Yes, we have to distinguish between capacity and activity.
Or viability versus vitality.
This distinction is so critical for precise language. Think about a microscopic organism, a water bear, a tardigrade. It can dehydrate itself completely and survive in the vacuum of space.
Or a human zygote frozen in a tank of liquid nitrogen.
Exactly. If we define alive as actively engaging in vital activities, moving, digesting, dividing, we'd have to say they aren't alive in that moment of suspension.
But they're not dead either. They haven't lost the potential for life.
Exactly. They still have the capacity. Their vital activities can be restarted just by warming up the zygote or adding water to the tardigrade. So we distinguish. Viability means having the capacity for vital activities and therefore being alive.
And vitality?
Vitality means you're actively engaging in those activities. So the frozen embryo is viable, it's alive, but it's non-vital.
And death then, in this context, is the true permanent loss of that capacity.
Right. Death is defined as the loss of this fundamental capacity. It's unviability. The biological structure is just no longer capable of controlling its own composition.
This framework also gives us some philosophical clarity on two terms that, science fiction loves to confuse: rescuation and revival.
Yes. Revival is just regaining vitality. That's what happens when you warm up the frozen zygote that was viable the whole time. Restoration, though, is conceptually different. It would involve something that has genuinely died, lost the capacity, and then somehow gets it back.
Like using a fictional corpse reanimator to reverse all the degradation and molecular drift that is death, and then restarting the vital activities.
Precisely. If that fictional device actually works, the person's life is restored. They're brought back from the state of unviability. And this little thought experiment, it just confirms that death is the loss of capacity, and that capacity is what we're really worried about losing.
So we spent all this time setting up this rigorous technical definition of death as the loss of this individual self-controlling capacity. Now, let's use that definition to tackle the much darker and I think much more interesting question. Here's where it gets really interesting. We've defined death as the loss of viability. But if the dead person is non-existent, unviable, unconscious, how can death be bad for them? I mean, if I can't experience it, how can it possibly harm me?
This is the central philosophical conflict when it comes to mortality, and it goes back over 2 millennia. Epicurus and Lucretius, in classical antiquity, they advanced this famous argument. It's known as the symmetry argument.
Right.
They argued that the non-existence you experience after death should be viewed with the same complete indifference as the time you didn't exist before you were born.
That's the famous quote, right? When we are, death is not, and when death is present, then we are not.
That's the one. They reasoned that since non-existence before you were born didn't cause you any suffering or harm, why should non-existence after you die be any different? And the modern philosophical argument, known as the deprivation account, has spent decades trying to logically break that symmetry.
So what's the synthesis of that modern rebuttal? What is the core counterclaim?
The central claim can be summarized in what philosophers call the executive thesis, and it goes like this. Death is objectively bad for an individual because it constitutes a deprivation of future intrinsic goods, a harm justified by the asymmetry between the necessary beginning of thick personhood and the contingent avoidable end of life.
Wow, that is a dense, high-stakes claim. So the context here is directly taking on and trying to resolve the challenge from Epicurus and Lucretius. We're accepting that the moment of death, if it's painless, isn't bad because it hurts. It's bad because it's a loss.
Yes, the focus is entirely on the value of the lost counterfactual life. But before we reconstruct the formal logic that justifies this, we absolutely have to establish the precise meaning of the technical terms we need. If we confuse them, the whole argument it collapses.
Absolutely. Let's make sure everyone listening is armed with the necessary conceptual glossary.
First term, lifetime welfare level. This is the cumulative total balance of all the intrinsic goods you accrue. Things like pleasure, accomplishment, desire, fulfillment, minus all the evils, pain, suffering, thwarted desires, all of that over your entire existence. It's like the total moral score of your life.
Okay.
Second, comparativism. This is the foundational idea of the deprivationist view. It says that an event is good or bad for us based on whether it makes our lifetime welfare level higher or lower than it otherwise would have been.
So it's a comparison between your actual world and a possible counterfactual world.
That's it. Third, we need the symmetry argument itself. The Epicurean claim that non-existence after death should be indifferent because there's no time when death can be ascribed to its unfortunate subject. We have to understand that claim to defeat it.
Makes sense.
Fourth, and this is critical, thick personhood. This refers to the biographical, psychological self. The self that's defined by its unique concerns, memories, hopes, relationships. This is different from just the bare physical organism. The harm of death applies specifically to the annihilation of this thick personhood.
Can you give us a quick non-academic metaphor for that, for thick personhood?
Sure. Think of it like this. If you had a complete molecular rebuild right now, the organism is perfectly restored, but you woke up with zero memories of your family, your career, your past choices. The thick personhood is still gone.
The person is gone.
The philosophical fear is losing the psychological self, not just the beating heart. And finally, we just retain the strict definitions from Part 1. Viability is the capacity to live, and death is the loss of that capacity.
Okay, armed with that, let's move to the hardest part. The actual logical chain that breaks the symmetry argument. This is the deprivationist argument in standard form, proving why post-death non-existence is a deprivation, but pre-birth non-existence is not.
So we begin with the measuring stick, P1.
P1, comparativism. Harm occurs if an event lowers our lifetime welfare level compared to a possible alternative reality.
Isn't that just common sense? Why do philosophers need to label it as P1?
They need to label it because P1 is not universally accepted. Some philosophers believe harm has to be felt or experienced in the moment of the harmful event. P1 explicitly rejects that by measuring harm against a counterfactual state. And that's crucial because a dead person can't experience anything.
Understood. Okay, so P2 details the actual mechanism of death's harm.
P2, deprivation. Death lowers our LWL by depriving us of future intrinsic goods, all the possible joy, accomplishment, and desire fulfillment we could have had if we'd lived. This is why we fear the permanence of non-existence, not the non-existence itself.
Right, but the Epicurean could just argue back, well, you were deprived of a good life before you were born too, and that brings us to P3.
P3, possibility. To be deprived of a good, that good must have been a possible realization of our existence. If something was impossible, you can't rationally lament its loss.
And here is the metaphysical key that breaks the symmetry. It focuses on the nature of our thick personhood. This is the point where the pre-birth scenario and the post-death scenario just fundamentally diverge.
P4, impossibility of earlier existence. Our sick personhood, that psychological biographical self defined by our unique identity, it cannot logically exist earlier than it did. It's defined by its origins and its history. I can't rationally lament not having been born in 1850 because that person wouldn't be me.
Exactly. If I were born in 1850, I wouldn't have met my wife, I wouldn't have my current memories or my career. The person who existed in 1850, even if they had my exact molecules, would have a completely different thick personhood. The counterfactual of earlier existence is structurally impossible for this self.
Right, the identity is just temporally bound to its specific beginning. Now contrast that with the end of life, which is P5.
P5, contingent end. Dying later than we will is possible. Death is often contingent. It could have been avoided by better medicine, different choices, or just sheer luck. Because death is contingent, the continued existence of this thick person is a possible counterfactual,
But being born earlier is metaphysically impossible for this person.
which logically forces the conclusion.
C. Conclusion. Therefore, the deprivation of future life is a rational fear because it was a possible realization of our existence. But the non-existence before birth is not a rational deprivation because that earlier existence was impossible for our thick personhood.
Boom. Symmetry broken.
And that reconstruction leads us straight to the most important element for you, the listener, understanding how we calculate this loss. The whole point of the deprivation account rests on that comparison between the actual lifetime welfare level and the counterfactual one.
The crux paragraph in the source material, the Gensist explanation, it says, to decide whether a person's death is overall bad for her simpliciter. We compare her actual lifetime welfare level to the lifetime welfare level she would have had if she had not died.
Okay, that needs to be explained in plain English, because it implies that death, in some situations, might actually be good for the deceased. We're measuring the net value lost. We're comparing an actual reality, where life ends early, against a counterfactual reality, where life continues and accrues more goods or evils.
Let's use the detailed illustrative example provided in the sources, the case of Hilda, who dies painlessly at age 25. And note, the painlessness means the moment of death itself scores a 0 on the welfare scale. The judgment hinges entirely on what would have happened next.
Let's analyze scenario A. Hilda dies at 25, painlessly. But if she had not died, she would have gone on to prosper for 25 years, achieving career goals, having a family, high welfare accumulation, before maybe experiencing a downturn, perhaps 5 years of illness.
In that hypothetical 30-year extension, her overall net value would have been overwhelmingly positive. Therefore, her death at 25 is objectively bad for her. It significantly lowers her lifetime welfare level compared to that realizable alternative. It's a massive deprivation of high value.
Right. Now let's switch the scenario. Scenario B, Hilda still dies painlessly at 25. However, if she had lived, she would have fallen into a debilitating depression and poverty for 25 years, very low welfare accumulation, before maybe finally experiencing 5 positive years just before her natural end.
In scenario B, the lifetime welfare level she achieves by dying at 25 is significantly higher than the LWL she would have accumulated in the counterfactual world where she survived. The extra 25 years of suffering would have just drastically lowered her total lifetime score.
So her death is good.
Therefore, her death at 25 is overall good for her because it prevents a significant net lowering of her lifetime welfare level.
What a chilling piece of philosophical accounting. The deprivation account isn't judging the moral timing of death, it's just calculating the loss or gain of potential value. It rigorously justifies why we fear death, because the possibility of a better future is usually far greater than the possibility of avoiding a worse one.
Okay, so philosophy gives us a rational, compelling justification for the fear of death. Now let's pivot to the vast, complex, often unconscious systems we build, individually and collectively, to deal with this rational fear. This brings us to terror management theory, or TMT.
TMT, which was formulated by Solomon, Greenberg, and Pyczynski, is, well, it's arguably the dominant framework in social psychology for this topic. It draws very heavily on the existential work of Ernest Becker. And TMT posits that the conflict between our hardwired biological instinct for self-preservation and our highly evolved cognitive awareness of our inevitable mortality, it creates this potentially paralyzing existential terror. It's the ultimate cognitive dissonance. My body is screaming, live forever, but my brain is screaming, you will die eventually. And since that raw knowledge is just too existentially disruptive to carry around all the time, we need an elaborate psychological defense.
That defense mechanism is what TMT calls the anxiety buffer. It's a complex psychological structure that shields us from the awareness of death. And TMT identifies three core interrelated components that make up this buffer, and they really explain nearly all aspects of human social life.
So tell us about the first component.
First is the cultural worldview. This is a shared set of beliefs that could be religious, political, scientific, national, that provides the universe with meaning, order, stability, and structure.
And crucially,
Crucially, the cultural worldview offers a path to immortality. It promises that we will somehow transcend physical death.
and this transcendence, it takes two essential forms, right?
Yes, literal immortality, which is the promise of an afterlife, heaven, reincarnation, and symbolic immortality, which is achieved by leaving a lasting, meaningful impact or legacy on history or culture.
That symbolic idea is just so profound. It's the human drive to create a monument to ourselves, whether it's a physical building, a work of art, a reputation that just endures long after our body is unviable. The sources point to that Bob Dylan quote about fame. Gonna win me some fame so people will remember my name when I'm gone. That's pure symbolic immortality defense.
The second component is the maintenance of self-esteem. This is the internalized belief that you are a valuable, contributing member who is meeting or exceeding the standards prescribed by that cultural worldview.
So if you adhere to the rules, live up to the script, achieve success within the parameters society sets, you feel worthy of the protection and promise of immortality that the worldview offers.
Exactly. Self-esteem is basically your score on the cultural report card.
And the third element bridges the gap between the self and the group.
It's close relationships and a sense of belonging. We initially seek security and connection from our caregivers, but TMT suggests that this emotional dependency, sometimes called the fantasy bond, is extended to the wider social group, to our national identity, even to charismatic leaders. The group supports this sense of collective safety and permanence, making us feel less alone and vulnerable against the void.
It sounds like TMT is basically proposing that so much of human conflict, ambition, identity formation, it all just stems from this fundamental existential terror. We're driven to defend the symbols that promise us we won't truly disappear.
Precisely. And this explains the intensity of what are called societal deaths. When people's mortality is made salient, a phenomenon called mortality salience, or MS, they become profoundly motivated to bolster their cultural worldview.
And bolstering your worldview almost always means defending your own group and demonizing the outsider.
Absolutely. This defensive mechanism, it drives intense phenomena like religious fundamentalism, fierce nationalism, political polarization. People aren't just arguing about policy. They're defending their shared cultural symbols of permanence. They're willing to sacrifice themselves in a war to preserve their group's symbols of immortality because they believe that by merging their identity with the group, they will achieve some kind of symbolic permanence.
It transforms the leader or the nation into the ultimate rescuer.
Yes. The transfer of that early childhood dependency onto the national group allows followers to compensate for their own feelings of insignificance and vulnerability. And this is why the simple existence of people with other worldviews is perceived as an existential threat.
Because if my neighbor believes the world operates under different moral or cosmic rules,
Those beliefs challenge the absolute validity of my cultural buffer. That threat fractures my emotional security. It undermines my promise of symbolic immortality. And that is why people fight so hard and become so hostile when their customs or their core values are threatened.
so moving from that collective defense, TMT also offers these powerful insights into individual ambition, particularly creativity, as a symbolic immortality defense. If you create something that endures, you live on.
The experimental evidence for this is strong. Studies using the mortality salience paradigm, where you subtly remind subjects of death, they show that MS significantly motivates creative pursuits afterwards. But the research identified a crucial psychological moderator.
What was the key finding about who actually benefited from the creative achievement?
The finding was that high creative achievement was associated with the reduced death thought accessibility, DTA, which means they thought about death less often, a good measure of reduced anxiety, only for people who also held high creative goals, CG.
So if you produce some amazing work, but you didn't actually internalize creativity as a central part of your self-identity or your worldview, the work itself didn't make you less afraid of death. It was just a hobby.
Correct. The work only functions as an anxiety buffering mechanism if it's congruent with your deepest held beliefs about how symbolic immortality is achieved. If you believe the pathway to eternity is through faith, and you spend your life painting, the painting won't buffer your fear.
But if you believe the pathway is through art,
Then every new piece is a step toward permanence.
This idea of congruence leads us directly to how these broader abstract worldviews, what the sources call ideological scripts, how they moderate these TMT effects, right?
Yes. Researchers use something called Tompkins polarity theory to categorize people based on whether they adhere to humanism or normativism. And this provides a really deep look at how different internal scripts manage external anxiety.
Okay, so define those two contrasting scripts for us.
Humanism regards human experience as the ultimate source of meaning. Humanists generally view human nature as inherently good, capable of self-actualization, and they encourage the free and unfettered expression of emotion. Their worldview focuses on growth and inherent value.
And the other side?
Normativism. It believes that meaning and morality have to be based on external, universal, rigid standards. They often view human nature as deficient or corruptible, and so they emphasize the inhibition of emotions and strict adherence to rules.
So when reminded of death, TMT would predict that both groups would immediately increase the defense of their own worldviews. How did the experiments bear this out?
Well, the results were partially confirming, but also surprisingly nuanced. When subjects were put through the MS procedures, the humanists did increase their defense of the humanist worldview. They became more expressive and defensive of tolerance and human goodness. That's consistent with TMT.
But the normatives?
The normatives did not show a significant increase in the defense of the normative worldview. And this finding, it really challenges the universal application of TMT.
So why do researchers think the normatives didn't respond defensively?
There are a couple of proposed reasons. One is just methodological. The assays they used to measure their defense in the study might not have accurately reflected the specific cultural values that normatives hold most sacred, especially in a secular university environment where the study was done.
Or, and this is more intriguing, maybe the normative script itself, based on strict self-control and inhibition, is already a highly effective, constant defense mechanism.
That's a strong possibility.
Oh.
If normativism, just by its very nature, encourages constant vigilant control over the self and the world, its adherents may be living in a state of perpetually managed mortality salience. They don't need the momentary MS trigger to ramp up the defense because the defense is already running on high.
Which suggests that the philosophical or psychological architecture of a person's core beliefs dictates the very form their death anxiety takes.
Absolutely. And this psychological battle against death anxiety has critical and often overlooked implications for mental health treatment.
It really does. The sources point out that conventional therapies, like standard cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, they often fail to address death anxiety directly. They just treat the symptoms, the anxiety, the avoidance, the checking compulsions, the repeated doctor visits, but not the existential root.
And that leads to the frustrating revolving door phenomenon in mental health, where clients just keep coming back with new symptoms because the core fear remains untouched.
So the goal for an effective existential therapy isn't to deny death, but to cultivate a specific, healthy form of acceptance.
Yes. Research has categorized 3 types of death acceptance. There's escape acceptance, which is welcoming death as an end to a painful life. There's approach acceptance, welcoming death because of a belief in a rewarding afterlife. And then there's neutral acceptance.
And the research suggests neutral acceptance is the goal.
It leads to the lowest levels of death anxiety and the highest levels of well-being.
Neutral acceptance is the most adaptive approach. It's similar to the ancient Stoics, really. Accepting death as a natural, uncontrollable part of life. Epictetus taught, death is necessary and cannot be avoided. Where am I going to go to get away from it?
And so therapeutic management focuses on achieving this neutrality using a combination of cognitive and exposure techniques. Cognitive techniques focus on challenging highly unrealistic or maladaptive beliefs about death or dying.
Can you give us an example of a belief like that needs challenging?
A classic is catastrophizing the consequences of one's own death, like believing my death will utterly destroy my children's lives forever. A therapist challenges this with factual realism. Your children will be devastated, yes, but most children do cope with the loss of their parents and eventually find happiness again. It also includes challenging unrealistic beliefs about the pain of dying itself, using corrective medical information.
And the other side of that coin is exposure. This seems essential for cultivating acceptance of the certainty of death, not just challenging the probability of dying from a specific thing.
Exposure is designed to break the cycle of avoidance. It can be imaginal, where the client writes vivid, detailed narratives imagining their own death, focusing on the sensory and emotional fears they hold.
Or it can be in vivo.
Right, real-world exposure. Visiting hospitals, walking through cemeteries, reading obituaries, or just the practical action of preparing a legal will. These actions force the individual to integrate the certainty of the end into their reality.
And this is where philosophy comes full circle and re-enters the therapy room.
Precisely. Existential psychotherapists often deploy philosophical tools. When they're dealing with clients who fear the state of non-existence, the void, they therapeutically apply Epicurus' symmetry argument, the one we dissected earlier.
So you turn the philosophical concept into a mantra for peace.
Exactly. After death, I will be in the same state of non-being as before birth. It provides a logical, non-threatening comparison to address the terror of the void.
Finally, we have to look at the specific, painful cognitive architecture of severe death anxiety, especially as it's found in suicidal ideation. The role of mental imagery here is particularly profound and distinct from just verbal thought.
This research is critical. Studies on suicidal patients found that when they experienced these periods of severe despair, they reported detailed mental imagery in addition to their negative verbal thoughts. And this imagery was often intrusive, repetitive, and contained these vivid sensory perceptual elements of future suicidal plans or of the actual state of being dead.
The researchers coined the term flash forwards to describe these images, linking them conceptually to the intrusive flashbacks of PTSD, but oriented toward a dreaded future outcome instead of a traumatic past one.
And the data showed a crucial difference between the content of verbal thought and the content of imagery. For categories related to the future, like planning a new attempt or imagining the consequences for loved ones, imagery was significantly more prevalent than verbal thoughts. Imagery just dominates the future landscape for these individuals.
And these weren't just vague concepts. The research showed that the severity of suicidal ideation was directly correlated with the perceived realness and the high level of preoccupation with these flash forwards. The images feel immediate, terrifyingly detailed, and true.
And this links directly to clinical action, because mental imagery is a strong determinant of future behavior. If you imagine an event, it increases both the likelihood of you acting it out and your perceived probability of it occurring. So therapy has to target these images directly.
The clinical implication, then, is the use of imagery rescripting. If we can use this technique to change the memory of a past trauma, to rescript a past event, we can use it here to change the compelling force of a future threat.
Yes. This involves the therapist working with the patient to actively change the outcome of the flash-forward image. Instead of seeing an image of a successful overdose, the image is rescripted to show the disposal of the tablets, or calling a helpline, or returning to a place of safety. By manipulating the sensory details in the outcome, the image loses its powerful, dreadful realness and its power to prompt action.
That is a truly practical application, transforming the psychological architecture of despair into a blueprint for survival.
So what this deep dive really reveals is a profound and integrated architecture governing the human experience. The philosophical effort to logically justify the objective harm of death, the deprivation account, is intricately mirrored by the psychological effort to erect defenses against the subjective terror of that lost terror management theory.
Right. We establish the definition of life as this fragile, compositionally controlled event that we rationally prize. We prove that death is bad because it's an avoidable, contingent loss that lowers our total potential accrued value, justifying our fear. And we've seen how that fear, that worm at the core, then compels us to form complex worldviews, build self-esteem, and engage in creative pursuits or fierce nationalism, all in service of symbolic immortality.
The intellectual, emotional, and social structure of humanity is, in large part, a magnificent response to our own impending mortality.
So, what does this all mean? We've built a case for why death is bad, rationalizing our drive for life. But let's leave you with a final provocative philosophical puzzle about the ultimate escape from death: eternal life.
The philosopher Bernard Williams, he challenged the fundamental desirability of endless life. He argued that to avoid a debilitating, crushing boredom across eternity, you would have to constantly replace your current categorical desires, the deep-seated goals and beliefs that give your life meaning right now. And you have to radically transform your character.
You would have to continuously annihilate your current self, your thick personhood, and replace it with a new self, with new goals every few decades or centuries just to keep going.
And this raises the critical question that builds on everything we've discussed today. If you change your fundamental personality and your core goals repeatedly across eternity just to avoid boredom, how much of the original you would actually go? You would still exist to enjoy that immortal life.
That's the ultimate paradox of transcendence, and something for you to mull on your own.